a forum on the topic, are human rights the cause or the cure for terrorism? A question that, sadly you might add, is more relevant than ever in light of the recent events and attacks in Copenhagen. My name is Morten. I'm a graduate law student here at the SDU. And I'm also involved in the KFS, which is the Christian student organization in Odense. And the KFS is also the sponsor of this event tonight. Veritas is Latin and means truth, and I realize that it's not very popular in our society today to monopolize truth, and but that's not the purpose of this forum either. A Veritas forum provides the platform for an equal discussion on some of the hardest questions in life, and investigates how faith and Christianity, what relevance faith and Christianity is to those questions. So tonight's event is not a debate. We're not here to see anyone win or lose. We are here for a constructive and respectful dialogue. At least I hope it will turn out to be. Our hope is that everyone in this room tonight will be challenged somehow. The reality is that there are people here from a wide spectrum of religious beliefs. And no matter what background you have, no matter what you believe or maybe don't believe, I want you to know that you are most welcome tonight, and we invite you to participate in the discussion. So if you're a Christian, we hope that you'll be challenged by both presenters. If you, on the other hand, think that Christianity is mystifying, irrelevant, or perhaps even misplaced in an academic environment like the university is, we hope that you will be challenged as well. Now, without further delay, I would like to welcome tonight's moderator, Niels Nyman. Niels is a pastor in Copenhagen. He has a PhD in philosophy of religion from the University of Cambridge. And actually he studied here in Odense back in the mid-80s. So please come to the podium and introduce our presenters and host tonight's discussion.
And thank you to the organizers. I think you have managed to pick one of the really most acute and difficult dilemmas for tonight's topic. Are human rights the cause or the cure for terrorism? And as Morten said, this is not going to be the blame game, but I believe as a nation we are still in a condition of shock after the terror attack Saturday, and this is the time to kind of take a step back and create a space for reflection. What are the mechanisms that create the possibility for such a thing to happen in our society? And in order to help us create that space of reflection, I'm very delighted and honored to welcome the two speakers for tonight. Bugge Thorbjørn Daniel is a local staff member of this university, associate professor and an expert in European and international law. You did your PhD on balancing trade and environment in the WTO. You teach human rights both in European and on international level. You're also married with 3 kids, and you are a football coach. So the other speaker is David McIlroy. He was a practicing barrister in London and a senior lecturer at the SOAS at London University. SOAS is, I think, the largest Northern European university entity working with Middle East, Africa and Asia. You have your master's degrees in law from Cambridge and Toulouse, France, and a PhD in theology of law from the University of Wales. And you have a wide range of interest and teach both in banking law. You've made a report for the European Commission on Albania as part of the preparation for its application to the membership of EU. You lecture on money laundering, and you've written quite extensively on human rights. So welcome to both our speakers, and Bugge, Thorbjørn, Daniel, over to you.
Well, this is a fairly intriguing question. I wish I could give you an answer straight away, but I have to disappoint you already now that I do not have the answer whether it's a cause or a cure. What I did was that when I accepted the invitation, I started thinking about the relationship between these two concepts, if you can call them that, human rights and terror. And one of the things that struck me is that terrorism and terror is not really very well defined. Actually, I'm tempted to say it's inherently controversial what is terrorism and what is terror. If we look back a bit, yeah, change it, please. I mean, the origins of the word is that it means great fear or dread, without any, you could call it, without any sender, without any recipient implied. And originally, it was used by the revolutionary French government to describe their own system of governance. So it was actually used by a government to describe the relationship with its population. So a reign of terror was a system of governance, which I think is, in modern days, it's kind of the other way around, because currently we see it as non-state actors protesting against a state one way or another. What you might think of in this connection is that a state is usually considered to be a combination of both a population and some kind of government. And I think that has relevance if we look into what terrorism is. The way I see it, I think terror can be and is used and is sort of relevant in two contexts. One of them is political, where it's used to sort of identify something as something bad, basically. The other one is legal, and obviously I was tempted to go that way, but I will spare you many of the details. But the legal way to look at it is find a way to describe it as a crime where we can actually punish somebody who's doing something. And that's where the main interest has been in the international law community. There is a very wide range of different definitions. Maybe if you can change. This is an example of what I would call a political view. This is from the United Nations General Assembly, saying that it's criminal acts, so something which is illegal already, provoke a state of terror in the general public, and that's where I think it's part of the state, or a group of persons or particular persons for political purposes. And I think this part with political purposes is the really important part when we look at it. And then the second part, I'm not going to go into the details. So when we see this one side of terror, this is what we use to say whatever's going on here is bad. We call it terror, and then everybody, at least those who are on our side, will recognize this is bad. But we also all know that there is a reverse side of the coin, basically. Whoever's called a terrorist here might be a freedom fighter somewhere else. So it's not really that clear cut. Maybe if you can change again. If we look at the legal side, then we look for sort of specific criteria which we can use to find out whether given action fulfill this definition. And the first column over here is from the Comprehensive Convention on Terrorism. It's a document from 2002. It hasn't been put into force internationally, but it was actually agreed that this is what we would use to define terrorism. Again, I think the important point here is that intimidation of a population or an attempt to compel a government or an international organization. You can basically see the same kind of thing on the right-hand column here. The right-hand column is the European Union definition of terror. There are small modifications, and you can see that from the wording, but I'm not going to go into the details. Again, the idea is attacks against populations or governments in order to try to compel them to do certain kind of action. So this is basically, I think what is, I mean, we can also go into some of the details on what kind of crimes it is, but I mean, that's killing and destroying and disturbing infrastructure and so on. That's not really very interesting. I think the interesting point here is that there is a purpose behind terror, which is described in this way. Could you change again, please? So, the way I see the relationship between terror and human rights, basically I see two different sets of conflict or two different sets of interaction between these two. There's no, I mean, if we look at it originally, where we had terror as a reign of terror from the state to the population, you could say human rights in that context would counterbalance the reign of terror. That, I mean, you can see it that way. But this is, I mean, this is not the way we see it today because the idea of terror has changed. So I see two different places where terrorism and human rights play together, or at least have some kind of interaction. One of the situations where we see this interaction is when you try to convince others outside your own state that they should accept or live by human rights or other kinds of standards. I mean, that's a noteworthy purpose when you look at it. But the point that I'm going to make here is that when you do that, the means you employ should fit the purpose. And if we look back at Danish recent political history, we all realize that going to war in 4 different places in 13 years around the world, in countries that are mostly of another religious belief than the majority of Denmark is not necessarily helpful in order to promote human rights in these contexts. I mean, the general idea was when we started what was termed the activist international, the activist foreign policy, was to promote democracy, human rights, security around the world. And in my opinion, that really doesn't work well together with the use of force and employment of arms in other countries. So that's one thing where I think there is a difficult situation existing between human rights and terror eventually, because, well, more or less logical that if you use terror, if you use arms in another country, use force, then you might risk these means are also being used against yourself. So if we look, on the other hand, on human rights, another thing that I think we should be aware of is sort of the nature, the various situations where we use human rights. The UN High Commissioner, he describes human rights as rights that inherently belong to all human beings. So something which is inherent for us as human beings. And then he describes what international human rights law provides. And I think what is noteworthy here is, again, that human rights, on the one hand, are meant to protect individuals from the state. That's what I would usually call a vertical relationship, where individuals are protected against action from the state. But there is also another thing called another aspect, another perspective on human rights, and it's more or less implied in the final lines here. Fundamental freedoms of individuals. There's also the horizontal aspect. So human rights, as they apply between individuals. normally when I teach about rights, I say, are you really aware that these rights apply to you in your relationship between each other? And I think when we think about it, yes, we know that, but that was very loud. But we're not always aware of it. And maybe if you can change again. I also found when I looked at the web, it's kind of interesting because there is a South African organization. It's originated in South Africa, Youth for Human Rights. And this may be somewhat naive, but I really like this way it was described. Rights because they're things you're allowed to be, to do, or to have. Okay, that's fairly easily understood. For your protection against people who might want to harm you. People, and that might be government, but it might also be other people. And then, and that's the final part that I really like, is that this presents human rights as to help us get along with each other. So my point here is, and this is the second point where I see a connection between terrorism and human rights, it's when we forget to balance. When we forget that they're also meant to enable us to live together. So in some I see a real problem when human rights are being used as a political means, forgetting that other people also have rights. So are human rights a cause or a cure for terror? I don't know. I can't say it otherwise than I can see at least two situations where there might be more cause than cure in the relationship between human rights and terror. And that's when you use human rights or you argue human rights and do something else on the international scene, but also when you, for political purposes, use human rights as sort of a way to embarrass or provocate other people. Are they a cure? Well, I don't know. We'll see. Right now I think everybody are more concerned about causes. So that's it for me. David?
I'm really grateful to Bugge for the way in which he identified how the idea of terror has changed. So that we have a reign of terror, the use of terror as a political instrument, which, as he indicated, was visible in the French Revolution, which declared it to be state policy, absolutely overtly. Not the first group of people to use terror as state policy. It was first advocated intellectually, I think, by Machiavelli in his book, The Prince. Use terror if you have to, be loved if you can get away with it. But in the last resort, in order to be effective, make the people afraid. Better to have them fearing you than to love you. And in a little country, little insignificant country, not very far south of here, of course, within the last 100 years, we saw terror used on an absolutely systemic, European-wide scale. That was the kind of vision that the Germans had under Hitler, was to use terror as a means of controlling people. So you have terror by the state, what we might call tyranny, I suppose, if we wanted to draw a distinction between that and the sort of thing we think about now, which is terrorism by individuals, small groups of people, who are, I think, fundamentally saying there is something that we regard as profoundly wrong with the way in which this society, this state, is organised. And so there's some form of shock to the system or shock to the people that we wish to administer through acts of violence. And human rights have three distinct historical starting points. They sort of get going three different times in history. And each one of those is a reaction to one of those two forms of terror, either tyranny by the state or terrorism. And in some cases, a reaction to both. As Bugge pointed out, the distinction between one person's terrorist and another person's freedom fighter often depends on which side of the argument you're on, or which side won, at least to persuade the historians that they won in terms of the judgment of history. And the first time we really see human rights getting going in a recognisable form is just after the end of the Middle Ages, when we see the sort of unity of Christendom breaking up and different groups of Christians thinking about how they wish to worship God, the kind of rites they want to get involved in. And that leads to war all over Germany, it leads to war in France, it leads to war between the Netherlands and Spain, and you get people fighting in the so-called wars of religion. And one of the big issues is, are the people on the other side really fully human? If you've given them the chance to see the truth and they've rejected it, does that mean you can just wipe them out? Have they become some sort of disease that you need to get rid of? And the answer to that question that is given by the man who founded international law as we know it, Hugo Grotius, a Dutch lawyer, he writes this book on the law of war and peace. And what he says is there are certain things you should not do to your enemies, even if you don't think they believe in the same God as you, even if you think that they are fundamentally and irretrievably wrong in how they think about things. So that's the first time we see human rights getting going. The second time we see human rights getting going is in that really, really confused period of history that we call the French Revolution, which gives us all sorts of wonderful things. We have the terror, we then have the rights of man, and then we end up with Napoleon, who declares himself emperor, much to Beethoven's frustration. And so you get all sorts of things going on. But what's the point of the rights of man? What's the aim of the revolution? The aim of the revolution is a challenge to political tyranny. It's having a go at the aristocracy, having a go at Louis XIV's legacy in terms of vast expense. The palace at Versailles is beautiful, but built at a time when people could not afford bread. And so you get a reaction there, and there's no doubt at this stage that that reaction is in part a reaction against the Catholic Church, which is seen as supporting a political tyranny. And then the third time that we see human rights getting going is after the Second World War. And we've been through a phase prior to the Second World War where, by and large, it had sort of become accepted that, well, we weren't really sure about values anymore or how things worked out. It was all a bit fluid and a bit vague, and basically we could kind of live with whatever made most people happy most of the time. A philosophy invented in my country, Britain, or given a label in my country, Britain, by Jeremy Bentham. And it just proved to be ineffective as a kind of intellectual resource when you're faced with people who say, well, actually, do you know what? The people who count for the purposes of working out what makes people happy are the Aryans. Those who are racially pure and blonde and blue-eyed. So, well, some of you in the audience will fit that criteria. One or two of you won't. And we see the horrors uncovered in the death camps and the concentration camps and on the battlefields of Eastern Europe, where a war was fought that was a total war. A war that was fought in violation of all those rules that Grotius had talked about in terms of how you treat people that think differently from you. And so after the Second World War, the question becomes, well, how do we make sure that those kinds of horrors don't happen again? And the answer given to that question by a French philosopher, Jacques Maritain, and by a Lebanese politician, Charles Habib, is that we go back to the idea of the rights of people, the right of individuals, one of the things that Bugge stressed. And we go back to a tradition that goes back to England, rather more an interesting and inspiring tradition in my view than the one that Bentham left the world, but that's another story. And it's an idea by a man called John Locke. And John Locke starts with the idea that men and women are equal and that individuals have rights. And he says, and actually amongst those rights, the pursuit of truth is so important that governments ought really to leave space for people to explore it on their own. It's a really bad idea, by the way, to let governments decide what is true and what isn't, because if you let governments decide what's true and what isn't, they tend not to go for the stuff that's true. They tend to go for the stuff that makes life easy for them in power. What does the government want to do? Government wants a populace that are nice and quiet and relaxed and calm and not really questioning things. And Locke says that's the reason why government is it's a bad idea to make government in charge of truth. Montesquieu says something very similar in France. And Locke gives us this idea of natural rights. He's on the bridge between an older tradition which would call this the law of nature, or natural law, and what we have now, which is human rights. And Locke is the key figure in that tradition. And he's the one who really becomes the philosopher for the United States. He's English, but he wrote some interesting stuff on the Constitution of Carolina, not his finest moment and not necessarily consistent with his general theory. But he becomes the philosopher that all the founding fathers of the United States look to. And what do they try and build their nation upon? The idea of the free pursuit of life and liberty and happiness. Now that's interesting. We see human rights time and time again being used to try and deal with issues of terror. Both tyranny by government and terrorism by individuals. And what you find with each one of these key thinkers, Grotius, Locke, Maritain and Habib, all of these key thinkers in the history of human rights theory, they are all Christian thinkers. In fact, Locke's argument for equality is widely regarded by liberal philosophers who want to proclaim Locke as one of the great essential heroes of the Enlightenment. His argument on equality is widely regarded as a bit of an embarrassment. And it's a bit of an embarrassment because Locke's argument on equality does not work as a piece of philosophy if you take out his Christian worldview. It's because Locke has read the Bible that he thinks men and women are equal. And his argument doesn't work any other way. It's not my view. That's the view of Professor Jeremy Waldron at Oxford, who wrote a book on God, Locke and equality 12 years ago. That is widely regarded as having just nailed the big, dirty secret about the founding father of liberalism. That worldview that we all live under in the West. And it's not just that these Christian thinkers are doing something that is a bit idiosyncratic. It's they're all going back, I think, to the founder of Christianity, Jesus, and his understanding of the relationship between individuals and the state. Because he lives in a time where both tyranny and terrorism are on the agenda. He's living in that little troublesome piece of land, Israel-Palestine, which seems to create as many political problems in the 21st century as it was 2,000 years ago. And what do we have there? We have an example of peace being pursued by military means in a far more aggressive manner than the Danish activist foreign policy. We have the Roman Empire proclaiming, well, we've given you the Pax Romana, we've given you Roman peace. How do we do it? By setting up a tributary system. You seen the Hunger Games? What's the city called in the Hunger Games? It's called the capital. Panem. Panem, bread. Because what did the Roman Empire give the people? Bread and circuses. The Hunger Games is just the Roman Empire system picked up and made intelligible for an electronic generation. And that's what you have, an oppressive, tyrannous system ruling the people through overwhelming military force. What are your alternatives to that? Well, you could go for the Pharisees, and the Pharisees, well, they're the Jewish religious establishment, and what do they want? They want a kind of Jewish version of Sharia law for everybody to live under. So you can swap your political tyranny with the Romans, you can swap that for a religious tyranny. But if you don't fancy either of those, you might want to go with the freedom fighters, or the terrorists, the zealots. And they're there with a campaign of terrorism. They've worked out they can't beat the Roman Empire in pitched battle, so their approach instead is a guerrilla warfare campaign. Now that's the political context in which Christianity is founded. And what does Jesus do? Does he say, let's get in bed with the Roman Empire because they're the ones in power? If they sponsor us, then we'll be able to take over the world. No, he doesn't do that. He says, give to God the things that are God's and to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Well, does he say, well, let's get in bed with the Pharisees? He says, no. Actually, you Pharisees have got it wrong. You're trying to control people's lives in a way which squashes out any room for them to explore questions of truth themselves. Or what then about the zealots? Does he go with the political revolutionaries? Well, when he's arrested, two of his followers have swords and are about to pull them out. And he says, put them away. And so right at the beginning of the story of Christianity, even before it's made it to Europe, let alone that little offshore island on the edge of Europe where I live, before we get there, you have a system which says there's a difference between politics and religion. The questions of truth are questions that are to be explored without the government controlling everything. And that actually questions of identity can be separated from questions of how we relate to God in a way that does enable us to do what we need to be able to do now more than ever, which is to be able to get on together and to live in peace. So I think I'd want to say that originally human rights were designed as a cure for terrorism. And there's some really interesting questions I'm looking forward to discussing about the extent to which, for some of the reasons that Bugge has identified and some others, that they seem to be in some circumstances operating as a cause of terrorism today.
We're going to have a short panel discussion now, and after that the floor will be open for questions from the audience. Well, thank you very much for your speeches. Both of you spoke historically about the concept, respectively, of terrorism and human rights. And Bugge, you traced terrorism back to the French Revolution. And David, you traced human rights back to kind of the religious wars in Europe. Well, ultimately back to Jesus, but that was kind of, that's surprising in a way, isn't it? Considering the state of Europe and human rights today, because isn't it the other way around in a way, that the secular powers, like French at the time of the revolution, they are the ones, you know, promoting human rights in such a way that the religious get offended, and in some cases terrorism arises from that. Isn't that what happened in Charlie Hebdo, and possibly what has happened here among us last Saturday? So I would like you to reflect, both of you, on the, more specifically on the relationship between freedom of speech and terrorism, and the sense in which this specific human right may cause or cure terrorism.
Well, the freedom of speech is one of the human rights that you can find, for instance, in the European Convention of Human Rights. And one of the things that strikes me when you look at some of the provisions, for instance, in the European Convention, is that you may have the right to freedom of speech, but at the same time, these rights are balanced. They're balanced against the state, but they're also, and that's where I think it's really, really important, they're also balanced against the freedoms of others. So there is implied, even if we call it the freedom of speech, there is in the notion, in the way it is described, there is a recognition that this freedom only goes so far. And I think when we come to the relationship again between freedom of speech and terror specifically, I think when you forget that it should be balanced, then you risk sort of, I might be tempted to call it, you risk hijacking the freedom and using it for political purposes. And you can do it on purpose, or you can do it inadvertently or by accident.
So that balancing, isn't that a reduction of the freedom?
No, it's a recognition that you can't have ultimate freedom and unlimited freedom for everybody. So it's, I mean, you can compare it to the kind of personal sovereignty. You can say, this is as far as my freedom goes, if yours is to go exactly the same. So it's a mirroring of freedoms, you could call it.
Right.
That's what I think when I call it balance.
David, you speak clearly from the point of view of believing, practicing Christian. One of the cartoons of Charlie Hebdo showed the Trinity, kind of the core Christian concept of God as a homosexual triangle. Shouldn't that be illegal? Isn't that blasphemous? And isn't it better that there were laws against drawings like that?
What are we trying to do when we protect the rights and the freedoms of others? Because I think Bugge is right that freedom of speech isn't absolute, it has to be balanced against the rights and freedoms of others. And there I think there's a difference between arguments and worldviews which I don't think need or to be protected through law, and people who I do think need to be protected through law. So if somebody is using their freedom of speech in a way which is suggesting that Jews are less fully human than Christians, or that Muslim lives are worth less than Christian lives. There was a shooting recently in Chapel Hill in the States. 3 Muslim students were killed, and there was a big question about why there was almost no news coverage of this at all. And the suggestion was that this was because they were Muslims, they didn't count quite the same way. Those sorts of things need protecting. So you need to protect anything that might demean individuals or demean groups or stigmatize people. But arguments, I don't think, do need protecting in quite the same way. Because questions about God are questions about truth, the only way you can discuss them is by having a free space which says, well, actually, there are certain things that people of different religions believe and people of no faith believe that are profoundly antagonistic, and they can't both be right. Christopher Hitchens cannot be right when he says God is not great, at the same time as the Archbishop of Canterbury is right when he says, well, Jesus is the best thing that ever happened to me. Well, how do you preserve that space? And where are the boundaries? And I think my personal sense would be, I am prepared to pay the price of being offended as the price for having the liberty to say things that other people might find offensive. Not gratuitously offensive, and not things that attack people or groups, but to be able to say, actually, I just think your argument is wrong. And perhaps sometimes, not only do I think your argument is wrong, I think your argument is dangerous, because its implications are, I think, profoundly disturbing.
Right. So, but isn't there a sense in which, for religious people, speaking blasphemous about God is always offensive? And I mean, isn't there also a sense in which perhaps Christians could be, in a way, helping secular people understand the religious feelings and reactions of Muslims in kind of an atmosphere as the one we are in at the moment?
I think that's right. I think one of the dangers I see, and I do think there are some dangers in human rights theory as we have it today. One of the dangers I think that human rights theory presents is it sometimes suggests that the only things that really matter, the only levers that there are for helping us to get on, are me as an individual being able to do what I want, and then the government protecting me. So that everything that we try and do in terms of negotiating how we live together, we do through law. Whereas I think that in the way that you suggest, education and self-restraint, what the newspaper that published the cartoons in 2005 referred to derogatively as a sort of self-censorship, I think there actually is a positive role for that. So you say, well, I know that in theory I could say that, but actually out of respect for my fellow citizens, I'm not going to say it. Or I'm going to think very carefully and choose my words in a way that causes as least offence as possible. And I think we because of human rights theory, the way we tend to deploy it, we do want to see the world in a kind of, well, it's either obviously illegal or it's fine. And actually that isn't the reality of living together. The reality of living together, if you live in any household with other people for more than 5 seconds, there's behaviour that's against the law, and there's stuff you wouldn't do because it really annoys your mum or your sister or your student housemate. And there is that area, and yes, the boundaries of that area are a bit fuzzy, but it works much better than that, than a rule that said, you will be fined if you don't put your washing in the washing machine, or take it out the washing machine, or clean up and put things in the dishwasher.
Right. Before we leave the floor open for the audience, I'd like to ask you a question that's perhaps a bit personal. When you study terrorism or terrorists, when we speak about this kind of topic, is it for you like studying insect? A kind of life that's so different from the human life that it's interesting, it's potentially dangerous, but it's not really, in a way, challenging for my kind of life. It's so different. Or is there something in you that resonates, or is there some kind of echo that make you think that, yes, perhaps under different conditions I could have become a terrorist as well?
I think there are two things that might partly get close to an answer. Recently I heard or I read somebody said that what is going on in the Middle East, in Syria and Iraq with the fundamentalists is basically the sort of the counterculture of our times. So I think to some extent we all times need a counterculture, and unfortunately this one is very violent. So I think that's kind of, we may find ourselves intrigued by the counterculture of our own time. I'm not saying that I'm tempted to bear arms right now, but I think I could be if the counterculture was right. That was one thing. The other thing is that in all societies you can't control everybody. There will always be somebody who's prepared to go quite far. And that might lead to them eventually being called freedom fighters, or they might be the other way around, they might be the terrorists. I would like to see myself as the one being the freedom fighter, but I'm not sure about it. I think that would be two explanations to the problem you pose.
So my surname is McIlroy, which means like the golfer. Like the golfer Rory McIlroy. It's the same surname. It means my family come from Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland is where, within the UK, we had a terrorist problem. And I remember going with my family, and round the ring road, round Belfast, which is the main city, we saw soldiers with automatic machine guns. There were 3 of them at every junction. One of them looking at the traffic, the second one protecting the first one, and the third one protecting the second one. And there were police stations with barbed wire fences, and there were jeeps that were done up like tanks. And the first time I arrived there, I thought, this is a war zone, and yet this is part of my country. And I remember driving through and being stopped at a police checkpoint, and we had a British number plate, big smile from the soldier. Then he asked what our name was, and our name, you can't tell from our name which side of the community we're from in Northern Ireland. And so his face dropped, and then he asked where we were going. And we told him where we were going, and it was a place that was known as a nationalist haunt, so it was a nationalist stronghold. And his face changed. And at that moment, I knew what it was like to live as a second-class citizen in my country. And I knew there was a section of the community, the nationalist community, the Catholic community in Northern Ireland, that were not treated the same by their government. And then I understood why there was a section of that community who were prepared to take up arms and become terrorists, because as they saw it, they were living under a tyranny. And it's just amazing to go back following the Good Friday Agreement. It's no doubt significant. They picked that day for an agreement, and they then did some more, and they got them sorted at Christmas. They thought quite carefully about the dates for those deals that were done. But they changed the structure of the government so that people no longer felt like second-class citizens. So yes, I do understand why people become terrorists.
Before we leave it to the audience, do you speakers have questions for each other?
I wonder if you want to say a little bit more about the point about human rights being for people's protection.
You mean against the state or against each other?
Yeah, I mean, given our topic tonight is, are they the cause or cure of terrorism? It's interesting, one of the 3 points you picked out was that they're there for people's protection.
I mean, if you look at the various instruments where you have regulated human rights, there's always a part on something which you might call absolute rights. Now, we already described freedom of speech as something which is not absolute, but there's always this, you have the right to life, and then it's qualified that you may, after a fair trial, you may be killed by the government. But, I mean, basically you have the right to life. You also have the right not to be tortured, and you have the right not to be enslaved. So there are sort of rights which are fundamental in that sense. And what strikes me is that you can use more or less a scale to describe it, because then you've got these rights that are counterbalanced. I was thinking about sort of listing the various counterbalances there are to some of these political rights, freedom of speech, but I mean that would be beyond today's purpose. But you can identify various counterbalances, you could call it, to some of the rights. And then there are rights where I wouldn't call them absolute and I wouldn't call them counterbalanced, but where the counterbalance is that they can be breached if it's by law. Fair trial is regulated by law, imprisonment is regulated by law. So there are sort of, I basically see it as three different steps. And some of these rights work mainly in the relationship between government and individuals, and some of them sort of work in both directions.
Thanks. That's a question.
The question you are does it have a lot of facets? Because is it really an all question? Is human rights the cause of the cure? Couldn't it be both? Isn't my freedom like the cause of voluntarism for other people who either don't like the way my freedom is? And don't we see like subjective approach to freedom that we have to respect what's going on in global scheme of things?
So let me just try to get it's a question of subjectivism in a way. If something is freedom for me, but it causes another person to feel, doing violence too.
Yeah, but also my interpretation of what freedom actually can be, because there's a lot of countries out there, citizens actually feel alright about what we would call inhuman things, where the state puts one person aside for the greater good, like in China and other places. So can we really force our own created, very westernized view and say that it's a universal freedom for everybody to follow?
I think, if I may
Yes, please.
suggest an answer here, I think one of the point that I made about not trying to promote your own freedom with the use of force, I mean, you can try to persuade people, and in a way it also relates to your idea of arguments, and not sort of demeaning other people. And I would say trying to force your own ideas on other people by use of force, for instance, is demeaning them, because then you're saying that your arguments are not good enough. And even if your arguments are not good enough to persuade these people, I think you'll have to respect that eventually. That would be my approach to this.
All the time we speak about the human rights, and just thinking, okay, we speak the human rights, what is our right to do? But if maybe the people will be educated about the obligation, because of course we know any right has an obligation, right? And you know what is your right, but you have to know where is obligation start. And then maybe somehow, if we know the obligation, we can avoid the terrorism, because you know where is the limit, and then knowing, you'll try to avoid and standing to go too far, right? Might be this a problem too, because the people don't know where is the obligation start in the human rights. Might be a source of the terrorism, because the people are not educated in that direction too. Because as I look, everybody thinks, I have this right. Yes, I have it. Okay, but what do you know about your obligation?
I'd agree with you. I think that, and Bugge might as well, that one of the things that's happened is that we are used to insisting on our rights at the expense of our responsibilities. And often, I think you are right, it's often easier to work out what the, if you'll forgive me, the English is clumsy, what the right thing to do is by starting and asking the question, what's my responsibility? That often if we just think in terms of rights, what we end up with is a clash of rights, where I appear to have the right to do this, and you appear to have the right to do that, and they collide. Whereas if we ask questions primarily in terms of responsibilities, how we ought to behave becomes clearer.
But this is very abstract in a way. Let's think it through, specifically in terms of freedom of speech. What does responsibility mean? Does that mean that kind of, yes, you have the freedom of speech, but don't say anything that will make other people angry? Is that what it means, or how are we to kind of implement that idea of responsibility in specific cases? I mean, like Trykkefrihedsselskabet, which is a Danish organization working very strongly for the freedom of expression, they say that freedom of speech means the right to demean other people, because that's how it will inevitably be seen by the other part if you speak against their opinion.
Well, that I think collapses the distinction I was trying to make between challenging somebody's arguments and worldview and attacking somebody. Now, I agree that in practice, and you have it even within a family context, you can move very quickly from having an argument with somebody about a particular view that they hold to them feeling that you're attacking them as a person. But somehow we have to a certain extent, be grown up about it on both sides. We shouldn't be causing unnecessary offence. We shouldn't be causing gratuitous offence. We shouldn't be demeaning people, because actually to demean someone is not to engage with their argument. It is to suggest that somehow it doesn't count because they're the wrong colour skin, or they're stupid, or something else like that. But on the other hand, we have to exercise some self-restraint and accept that there are, on occasions, going to be points where people attack and challenge things that are profoundly important to us. And it is very easy to react distinctly to say, well, they're clearly getting at me, rather than simply saying, well, look, I am concerned about what you think, because I think it's wrong and I do think it's dangerous.
If part of the purpose of exercising your freedom of speech is to engage in a dialogue, you also need to show a good example. I mean, it can work. If you can probably get your message across. I entirely agree with you. You should never demean other people. I mean, if we look in history, we can see all situations that have turned into mass violence. One that started out with the radio stations calling, I always tend to forget who's who, but the other side, cockroaches. Jews were less in the Nazi regime. So demeaning is always, in my mind, a sort of a step before extermination. So we should never go that far, but I mean we can set an example in the way we approach a discussion. And if we're in doubt whether or not we insult somebody, why not express that doubt and then say, I may risk insulting you, but that is not my purpose. And then I think the other side will say, okay, I accept that your purpose was not to insult me. Actually, you did, but let me answer your arguments. I think that way might work. But we had, just to sort of summarize it, we had a brief, you called it grown-up element. We had a discussion over dinner where it was mentioned that if you sort of try to show kids the cartoons and tell them that they're offensive, most young kids will know that they're not supposed to bully or harass other people. So apparently it's something that we teach our children and forget when we grow up. Some of us do. And that's kind of interesting, I think.
I would like to raise the question. We're talking a lot about the perfect citizen, the perfect, you have to act in a perfect way to express doubt if you are offending someone. But how can we accept human rights when we are not following them ourselves? for example, the US, Guantanamo, and so on. Is that not like the same example, just on state basis?
I think the short answer you'll get from any international lawyer is yes, Guantanamo is outrageous. You know, it's very, very simple. You either have people you're at war with who have to be treated as prisoners of war, or you have people who are criminals who have to be treated as criminals. You don't invent a third category just because it suits you, and you happen to be the biggest state in the world. Because, you know, that's all very interesting, and I understand why the US did it for reasons of practical politics. But when the US is no longer the most important state in the world, I expect China, or whichever state is, to say, well, there's our precedent for ignoring international law and it suits us. No, Guantanamo was an outrage.
I think there's only one word for it: hypocrisy. And you're quite right. And that's basically also what I mean when I say you can't promote human rights by the use of force. You have to try to live by the standards.
Yeah, but like we can see, like the example is the racism against the black people in the US, and Soviet actually pointed out that US did not follow these human rights they proposed themselves, but still it was allowed because, yeah, it's ourselves, we can step over the boundaries because we don't have to follow them. And why should other countries, for example, terrorists, why should they not do the same? Like, these are rules, but we can step over them because everyone else are stepping over them as long as it's only for themselves. Is that not like two rules, one for us and one for everyone else?
I don't believe that all countries should necessarily have the same internal rules. I think the rules apply in two different situations. I mean, internally in a country, and then what you expect other countries to do, or what you want to do in relation to other countries. And I think there is a difference there. Because otherwise, every country should be the same. You can just look around the world and you can realize that no country is the same as any other country. So, but still, you can expect other standards. You can employ the human rights in the relationship also between states, but you can't expect necessarily that they should all fulfill the same standards internally. But at least there should be some kind of consistency in what you promote internally and what you say externally, and say and do externally. That would make sense, at least.
Very close to where I work is where Amnesty International was founded. And they were very alive right at the beginning to your point about hypocrisy. And so Amnesty doesn't let people from a country comment on that country's human rights record. So if you're British, you can comment on the human rights record and be assigned to have a look at any country in the world apart from the UK. And then they get people from other countries to comment on the UK, so it becomes a form of peer assessment. And that's one of the ways of kind of building that expectation of what we expect as minimum standards.
There's an interesting sort of by-story to that, because if you look at the way they compose the court in the European Court of Human Rights, they always include the national judge. Sort of that's the reverse solution. They always include the judge from the country that is at the bench, basically, because he knows the system. But you can also see him dissenting frequently, because he knows that it would sometimes be bad for the career to go against his own government. But he's on the bench.
Okay. As you said, the French Revolution started with the human rights and many things. The French Revolution was the right to food. Why do you think that the freedom of speech is the most controversial human right today?
I'm not sure that freedom of speech is the most controversial human right today. I know it's the one that's been in the news in France and here recently. But in some ways, the attacks in Denmark were attacks on freedom of association, people getting together to talk about things, or attacks on freedom of religion in the case of the attack on the synagogue. And certainly I think during the years following 2001 and the attack on September the 11th, the right to torture, which Bugge mentioned as one of the absolute rights, that was incredibly controversial, because suddenly we had this terrorist threat, and, well, information gained under torture would be what we now need to do to get hold of it. So I think there are a number of human rights. The three that cluster together, association, religion and speech, fit together very closely, because if you don't have freedom of religion, you tend not to have the other two. But also the rights to torture, all of those I think are controversial at the moment, precisely because I think of the way in which they are either a focus of terrorist activity or an attempt to respond to it and react to it, or defy it in some cases, I suppose.
I think one of the reasons that freedom of speech may seem to be very important these days is that it's probably the one that has, where the sort of the conditions for its exercise have changed the most in recent years. I mean, when I grew up, we had one television channel here in Denmark, and no internet and no cell phones. And I mean, you can tweet from your cell phone, you can go on the internet, you can send everything out. So I think the way to express yourself has changed in a way that makes it very obvious that something is changing in relation to freedom of speech. You have a larger audience, basically. And I think that changes a lot for the exercise of the right. I mean, when you had only one television channel, you would have some kind of self-censorship, because that television channel would know that it should not offend other people. But now, if you segment the market, then you get internet channels promoting jihad. Okay, there's no restraint, no self-restraint in that respect. And you can get the same, I think there will also be fundamentalist Christian channels promoting things that you would probably not agree with. So I think it's probably changing technology.
I think Bugge's right about that. I think there are two things. One is, it is possible, if you want to now, to live in an entire world where the only things you hear are things that reinforce your views. If you want to, you can find 24/7 coverage on internet or wherever it is, of whatever you already think. But the other side of that is, there is no such thing as a private conversation now. Anything you say could be up somewhere and being read by people anywhere. How many people in the Middle East subscribe to Danish newspapers, and yet suddenly it's world news? That's the difference.
So it's not just that the technology allows for communication to reach much broader, it's also that modern technology allows that there is a selection of information that will reach you according to your views and your agendas, that will confirm your... And that leads back to the question raised before concerning the kind of objection that really human rights, or the discourse of human rights, is a kind of cultural Western imperialism that is imposed on the rest of the world. Is that a fair objection?
I think I'd want to say no and yes. so let me have a go at the no. So the no goes like this. As I suggested in my argument, Locke is the guy who switches from what was the idea of natural law in the past to what we now have as human rights. And they're covering the same space. And the idea of natural law was an old idea that Jews and Christians and Muslims and Greek philosophers, and as you can find in some of the Chinese religions and aspects of Hinduism as well, that there was a kind of objective order of things in the universe. And that order wasn't just scientific, but there was a sort of common bedrock of morality that you could sort of boil down to. And insofar as human rights is pursuing that sort of project, it needn't be culturally imperialist. It is much more about a sort of, well, actually, if we all sat down and talked about it, we would get down to a sort of bedrock of where we agree, which we could then use to see how far we could build up from. But I think insofar as we use these things called human rights to protect those fundamental values, that can be culturally imperialist. there are examples of other societies at other times in history, bits of the Ottoman Empire in certain places and at certain times, they're not universally, perhaps bits of even Genghis Khan's empire at one point, where there was some sort of recognition of common rules that allowed people of different faiths and no faith to live in peace that are there. So there have been other mechanisms and approaches in the past used to protect these values. And those might provide us with some bridges to get away from a partially justified objection that the way these things are being written and formulated is specifically Western.
Actually, you started out mentioning Romans, and they had an interesting way of bringing together cultures, because they realized that, well, they had multiple gods, but when they conquered a new people, they realized, okay, this god compares to our god with that name, and they merged them. So it was a way of bringing together the religions of the people they conquered, and I think that, I mean, that was another way to solve part of the problem.
So there was an integration in the sense that the totality was changed through the kind of colonializing new lands. It was not just that it was put under the unchanging Roman standards, but the standards were changing as the empire grew, kind of. Yeah. So, yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight at this discussion.
If you would like to know more about KFS, the sponsor of tonight's event, you can go to the stand just outside this room. Please, if you would be so kind, fill out the survey cards. I just need to mention that if you do put in your email address, we will not send you anything else but an online survey for us to gather information about these events. So there's no spam, there's nothing. I'd like to thank everybody for coming tonight on this very relevant and interesting topic. Please give a round of applause again for our presenters.